I'm Ryan, this is 52SE Friday, week 4. What is the Flowy Stonies Collection, or FSC? What are the challenges to this style, and how do we intend to solve them? All that is coming up. I love it because it moves, a look that makes people ask, is that alive? There are LPS large polyp stony tanks, and there's a subset of that we call Flowy Stonies. These corals are best known for their natural sway, but it can also be a gentle jiggle of large puffy tissues. The corals have a mesmerizing, inflated look close up. The closer you get, the more amazing the polyp structure is. Pull it back, and the entire wild colony is no less stunning. What may surprise some is how many variants there really are. Galaxia's micro-torch-like structure, Scully's puffy, colorful structure, torch corals with neon tips. Similar to that, hammer corals where the end of the polyp's different, but it's these subtleties that make the collection so cool. The shades of fluorescent movement that make the tank come alive, sometimes coming across as more sentient than other corals. There are color variations within the same color type, shades that you just don't see anywhere else. That's what a collector's tank is all about. Not just as many flowy stony coral types as we can find, but capturing the subtle variants of each, different behaviors and growth patterns, each variant speaking to us in different ways. Our mission here is within a single tank, the widest, most diverse set of flowy stonies, and one of the coolest collections we can possibly build. Time to meet the FSC tank and the unique challenges. This is essentially a low-par mixed tank with a wide variety of corals that prefer different habitats, but naturally most don't populate rock structures common in reef tanks. Some grow on the seafloor, often covering huge areas way outside of what we've done in home aquaria. Some populate ridge lines or cavernous ridges, but other corals often dominate those areas. Some preferring sand as their desired habitat or populating mounds of mixed colonies. Even mounds and ridges that resemble the aquarium, but the bulk of the coral grown at the top of the structure and not the sides where most of us mount coral for our tanks. So that's the challenge. Dozens of different coral types. Not all, but many of which would prefer seafloor, sand beds, or horizontal surfaces that face upward to the light source. But in a marine tank, we want them to face the glass so we can see them the best. In a collector's tank, we want as many types and variants as possible, regardless of where they would naturally settle and thrive. That means taking what we know about their collective preferences and applying those lessons in a deliberate manner that serves our desires and theirs. Our solution starts with a 4-foot Red Sea Reefer Peninsula 500, very similar dimensions as a standard 120, with one major difference. The Peninsula essentially doubles the number of corals and size of our potential collection by creating 2 4-foot viewing panes or 8 feet of coral and one really cool vantage point down the center where you can see it all with that sense of depth that peninsulas are known for. For the rock habitat, our solution was one large snaking ridge down the center with a slope on both sides using Marco Rock's new coralline purple rock. The ridge has some of the visual interest of many of the ridges that you would see while snorkeling or diving. Especially those covered in coral, the horizontal slope providing maximum surface area for coral mounting, where the largest corals go on the bottom and the smallest go on the top to minimize shading those below. However, keeping in mind that many of these corals would prefer to actually face the light, we have to go further than sloping alone, and the lighting will have to address that in just a moment. In the center, there's a pass-through that the fish already use heavily to get from one side to the other. Many fish are more active and engaged when it's not possible to see the entire habitat at once, and once they're forced to continually explore. They seem to prefer the pass-through to do that versus going over or around the scape. On a whole, the peninsula, double-sided ridge with a thin sloping scape, pass-through, and essentially twice the swim path and coral mounting surface, the basis of our habitat design that meets our goals. Marco is one of the very few rock types that we could use to create this ridge structure because the thin slope look almost requires something that you break apart and then reassemble together. It's built out of a lot of small pieces with superglue gel for initial stability and Seachem's Coralcrete epoxy for long-term stability. 52SE will have a full how-to on building ridge aquascapes like this one, as well as an interesting kit version of a ridge that can be built with stacking alone. Sand, a mix of ocean direct original grade with a few pounds of Tampa Bay saltwater sand. Microbiome provided with the bacteria on the ocean direct sand, and TBS sand. TBS sand is from the ocean, bagged in water and immediately sent to us, a solid microbiome donor. Galaxy pods from Algae Barn. After seeing how they chew through the diatoms and the biome investigates, they'll be in every new dry rock tank that we set up, seeded before the lights come on and after. Dr. Tim's for the cycle and keeping the fish safe. Microbacter 7 for competing pest organisms before they take hold. This is just a much more deliberate approach to jump-starting the microbiome than we did with the 160. The hobby has wavered between wet live rock to dry rock or sand as lessons have been learned and availability have changed. With 52SC, we're approaching each tank with something more application specific. In a high par tank that rapidly fuels photosynthetic pests, the livest rock and sand possible. In lower par tanks, balancing the hours I need to assemble the desired aquascape, make it secure, dry rock with a deliberate approach to microbiome is our choice with this tank. As we just shared, in nature, many of these corals will form horizontal sheets populating the seafloor and grow towards the light source. Shadows are less of an issue because they're evenly illuminated. On top of that, the 30 to 50 foot depths, the corals have adapted to a different type of light, not just in intensity, but also spectrum. Nearly all of the red and much of the violet light has been filtered out. The corals absolutely display different reactions to violet light, red light, and the wrong par and shading. The lighting solution needs to address that. An install of just a couple modules over the center, focused on the top of the scape, creating easy to shadow light, is far from ideal. Our solution is 2 Kessel A360s, 4 AI blades with the 4 light hanging kit and suspended from the ceiling, which is the cleanest, most elegant way to mount lights on a peninsula. We want the corals to grow towards the light. In this case, the Kessels will cause the corals at the top to grow upwards towards the light, but all the corals in the mid to the bottom of the tank will grow towards their primary light source, which is actually the light strips on the sides of the tank and the reflections off the glass. Net result is a low shaded scape that promotes our desired growth patterns of maintaining that sloped style scape, but the majority of the corals angled towards the glass for the best display. The Kessel with these settings, 2 AI blade glows with these settings, and 2 AI blade grows with these settings. That tune provides a wide blue spectrum where the violet to blue portion mimics the sun in the tropics, but deeper than other tanks in 52SC with less red and violet, more similar to the light found at these depths. We refer to tunes that look like this: LPS solar blue. The difference between solar blue and LPS solar blue is something that we'll fully explore in our science episodes. Note that what we have done here is just one way to light a tank and specific to all of our goals. 52SC's mission isn't exact builds or recipes. These are just tanks for backdrops of sharing biologically sound application-specific concepts and related results that should be adapted to your goals. For instance, once you understand the primary biological goals here, they can be emulated with different priorities. The Aquatic Life DX dimmable T5 hybrid fixture, a 0 to 10 volt controller, and a pair of ATI Blue Plus and Coral Plus fluorescent bulbs, a much simpler, lower cost solution. An 8 bulb dimmable ATI T5 fixture, an even easier to install and lower cost, biologically sound solution. The spectrum from both the Kessel as well as the ATI bulbs is close enough to solar LPS blue out of the box. The large fixtures, both blankets of light that eliminate shadows and dimmable par that can be tuned to the needs of a tank like this. The difference between these 3 options: fine-tuning color, shimmer, aesthetic appeal, control options, apps, and cost. But they will all produce very similar biological results. None of them are the best option without applying your specific goals, and that's the most important lesson. Most of the Flowy Stony corals have adapted to a different type of flow and gas exchange. The large polyp structure captures a lot of light and requires a significant amount of carbon dioxide for carbohydrate energy production, and then oxygen for respiration and metabolic energy production, some of which is provided by that symbiotic relationship between the coral animal and the zooxanthellae algae. The rest through gas exchange with the surrounding water. That exchange is helpful in eliminating or dealing with damaging byproducts or oxidants from rapid photosynthesis. At these depths, the larger polyp corals, specifically those with big puffy tissues, tend to be exposed to sustained or shifting currents, just washing over their tissue for a gas exchange, versus turbulent, chaotic flow close to the surface that's a result of weather, rapidly shifting pressures, currents, and waves colliding. These fragile polyps do not do well with that kind of flow. Our challenge is creating prolonged shifting currents within the tank that flush the surface of the corals without damaging them. In a peninsula, the challenge is how to do it while retaining a clean, cord-free look that peninsulas are known for. We also need to embrace the inevitable with a power outage solution, because that's when gas exchange goes from important to life-saving. Our solution's simple: 2 Cloud 350 gyres positioned on the back to shoot water along the glass, which travels back across the other side and creates that gyre current within the tank. That sustained gyre current gently drags water near it with that flow. This is how we get water to the corals and flush their surface. To keep the water saturated with oxygen, one of the gyre's directional heads aimed towards the surface on each side, but the Air Aqua skimmer's millions of bubbles the primary air-water interface. For power outages, the Vectored return pump is hooked up to the Ecotech battery backup and turns on automatically to replenish oxygen. The Apex's heartbeat will let us know remotely when the power is out so we can implement longer-term solutions if necessary. Like all stony corals, the Flowy Stonies will pull out calcium, alkalinity, and other elements to precipitate a skeletal structure. Most are slower growers and often considered low demand, but the coral density in this collection will be high, so consumption will be high as well. There will be elemental uptake by the refugium, and they'll need to consider pH because there's a lot of people breathing CO2 in this facility. Our solution, Triton Core 7 on a 4-head Versa that replenishes elements from coral and refugium photosynthesis, consistent 1.25% daily water changes from the dose that will dilute inevitable imbalances from any ion replenishment system, low ion RODI water in the Tunes oscillator to combat evaporative pressures and ionic concentration, pH managed by the refugium soaking up CO2 at night, and Core 7 by day. But ultimately, a high density of corals and CO2 uptake will likely be what manages pH the best in the end. Well, skeletal growth is widely understood and more or less mastered. The open challenge in every reef tank is understanding and supporting tissue growth. That tissue is about half protein, 1/3 fats or lipids, and the rest a mix of carbohydrates and minerals. So where do the corals get what's required to make all that? The zooxanthellae provide about 70% of it. Zooplankton, marine snow, bacteria, and surrounding water does the rest. The historic debate was, can we really rely on solely light and zooxanthellae? What we know today is that's an incomplete approach. It doesn't contemplate precursors to protein and lipid production, essential amino and fatty acids, or organic versus inorganic sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. A more complete understanding is an entire episode of its own, and it is coming, but there is an obvious missing piece in most marine tanks. Wild coral fields often have very low inorganic nutrient levels of nitrate and phosphate. Nitrate and phosphate are rapidly diluted to the rest of the ocean or scavenged by algae, bacteria, and other organisms. However, in a healthy ocean reef, there are very commonly rich inorganic nutrients like particulate and dissolved organic matter from fish waste, algae breakdown, and bacteria that all settle to the floor and collectively referred to as organic nutrients and sometimes marine snow. Feeding on this is one of the coral's natural methods of acquiring nitrogen and phosphorus for its own biology and the zooxanthellae's metabolic processes. This is the inverse of a typical reef tank, which often has a lot of inorganic nitrate and phosphate, but very little organic nutrition that contains nitrogen and phosphorus like zooplankton, bacteria, waste particles, or marine snow. Our solution, a nutrient system that feeds the corals but doesn't end up in polluting the tank. Heavy in, heavy out. Similar to the ocean where the currents and tides and fish bring the foods in, but they also flush the excess out to sea and dilute it so the reef isn't polluted. The AFS auto feeder with a small amount of seaweed extreme pellets that'll go off a few times a day for the herbivores with digestive system designed around a high carbohydrate, high fiber diet. On weekdays, we'll also feed frozen foods based on either frequent small plankton foods like Calanus or eggs for small active fish like Anthias, or larger protein like PE mysis or clams on the half shell for carnivores. And then another AFS with protein and fat-rich TDO pellets for weekends and holidays, which is about 120 days a year here where nobody's here to feed. Any day that we're here, a daily edition of Brightwell's Coral Amino for the corals, all of this done with the fish and corals' health and natural biology in mind, but way more than most of us used to feed. Pollution just isn't the same challenge that it used to be, which allows us to think more about the coral's natural biology and be better reefers. Pollution in a collection tank like this has one fairly dramatic change in the first 12 to 18 months. It will start off like any old tank, requiring a healthy approach to filtration. But once it's packed full of acclimated corals that have shifted to growth mode, they will rapidly suck up most of the organic and inorganic pollution, almost like a coral refugium. So that's a challenge. Start with heavy pollution export and filtration, and then scale back over time. Our approach to filtration, SPDID, short for suspension, particulate organics, dissolved organics, inorganic nutrients, and dilution. Particulate waste suspended with the opposing gyre currents and a supporting aquascape design that doesn't have any major detritus traps. Organic particulate matter removed with Red Sea's Reef Mat. This is one of those advantages of the Red Sea tank and sump combo because it's designed to take an automatic roller, filter sock, or no particulate filter. Most tank sump combos I would have skipped the roller because the retrofit isn't worth it unless it's going to be there long term. In this case, it's going to allow us to add more fish sooner and make the first 12 to 18 months a lot easier, and then we'll retire it. Dissolved organic compounds, yellowing pigments, odors, and similar handled with the Air Aqua Skimmer and ozone kit with the Ozotech ozone unit. ORP control to not go over 450 and on for only 1 hour a night at 1 to 2 a.m. One of the dual intakes on the skimmer adjusted to recirculate mode, which increases the ozone contact time and maximizes the effectiveness with as little ozone as possible to get the job done. Inorganic nutrients removed with the Refugium and Kessel's Tuna Sun Full Spectrum Light, which outperformed the Refugium-specific models in our most recent tests. If I had to rank one filter as more important than all the others, it would be the Refugium. It's the only one that removes the actual pollution and fuel from many of the pest organisms before they can utilize it, while simultaneously soaking up the excess CO2 in the room, raising the pH, providing a safe haven for microcrustaceans, and leaks metabolites into the water for the corals as well. Dilution be a 1.25% daily water change with the dose. You might ask why the solid dilution schedule if the Fuge is maintaining low nutrients. The answer is what you can't or don't test for, but we should acknowledge. Pollutants in the surrounding air, on your hands, ionic imbalances and impurities from additives, biologically imbalanced minerals from foods, even excess sodium and chloride from 2 parts, and chemical pollutants, all will harm the animals over time. Anything that we put in the tank or even comes in contact with it pollutes it in some manner. This is the unavoidable reality of a glass box of water relying on perpetually recycled water, filters, and imperfect artificial foods and chemistry solutions. There are 2 things that a 1.25% daily, 10% weekly, or 35% monthly water change does. First, it changes out the recycled water with just over 50% fresh, ionically balanced water every 2 months and nearly all of it every 6 months. A different way to look at this I think is actually more meaningful is as long as the sources of pollution and ionic imbalances are stable, a dilution schedule like this means that no impurity, known or unknown, will ever get worse than it would in just over 2 months. Whether or not a marine tank receives regular, consistent water changes with a purpose might be one of the best predictors of coral mortalities and long-term success out there. This tank has all the same challenges with fish parasites as any other. What's different is the amount of coral parasites and bacterial issues that come with LPS corals. Flatworms, nudies, brown jelly, and so on, primarily because they hide in the skeletal structure or what they're mounted on. Fish parasites handle with introducing as few as possible by getting proactively treated healthy fish from marine collectors and then our 57-watt aqua ultraviolet UV sterilizer. Coral parasites, disease, and infections something else entirely. They'll be treated at introduction with a more aggressive approach to dips and baths, freshwater, oxidants like peroxide, natural oils. In corals, where bacterial infections are common, antibiotics. In theory, the lower-like corals that are found deeper can be kept at lower temperatures as well. However, the standard of 78 degrees in marine aquaria is already on the low range. Thermal energy and how it affects the biology of various corals is something that we will dive into much deeper throughout 52 SE. In this tank, we had thermal energy with a stable temperature room and 2 200-watt BRS titanium heaters managed and monitored by the Apex, backed up by the innovative marine controller that has 2 cords and can accommodate them both. In the case of excess thermal energy, mostly the result of the room getting just too hot, managed with the Tunes Aqua Chic fan and alarms so we can do something about it. The biggest challenge with the collector's tank is how big that investment is into coral and how fast it can go bad. It may not all be at once, but there's a lot of money that's going to go into these frags. Every environmental system that can be is implemented with redundancy, a centralized controller, backed up with individual controllers. Any sensor worth using in the first place has a backup. Alarms are audible locally and delivered remotely. All of the redundant parameters are displayed right next to the tank on the adaptive Reef interface board. The chances that environmental failure or common environmental management disasters harms this tank, or even more than a speed bump, are minute. That's the mission with the Flowy Stonies tank, the unique environmental challenges and how we intend to handle them. Next week, it's time to meet the Aquarium collection or reef building rainbows. BRStv subscribers get to see it all in the full 52 SE playlist right here.